Imagine yourself dragged from your home, stripped bare, smeared with filth, and paraded through the streets while your neighbors jeer and children laugh. You're not being executed. No, death would be far too merciful. This is Egypt, a civilization that built pyramids to honor the dead and crafted punishments to haunt the living. Today, we uncover the methods behind this ancient psychological warfare, the rituals, the spectacles, and the terrifying brilliance behind a justice system built not just to punish, but to remember. Chapter 1. A system built on memory. Ancient Egypt wasn't just obsessed with death. It was obsessed with how you would be remembered after it. The tombs, the statues, the hieroglyphs all served one purpose: to preserve your name and identity for eternity. Memory was sacred, and reputation was your bridge to the afterlife. This mindset didn't just shape religion, it shaped law. The justice system in Egypt revolved around more than fairness or rehabilitation. It aimed to uphold Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, and harmony. And when someone broke that order, restoring it required more than a slap on the wrist. It required a performance, a ritual of punishment designed to imprint the crime into the minds of everyone who saw it. When a person was sentenced, the question wasn't just, how can we correct them? It was, how can we make sure everyone remembers this mistake? Every punishment had layers: spiritual meaning, social consequence, and public impact. Scribes recorded events in temple scrolls. Reliefs etched images of punishment into stone, and communities were trained to be witnesses. It was a society that didn't forget. To the Egyptians, justice was part of memory, and memory, whether glorious or shameful, was forever. Chapter 2. Humiliation by design. In ancient Egypt, punishment wasn't just something that happened in the shadows. It was orchestrated like a public ritual, a carefully designed performance where humiliation took center stage. Egyptian authorities didn't rely on brute force alone. They engineered disgrace with psychological precision. The purpose wasn't just to punish the body, but to unmake the person. Imagine being tied up in the marketplace, not for a beating, but to be smeared with dung, not beaten with rods, but degraded with rot and ridicule. It may seem absurdly cruel to modern eyes, but in ancient Egypt, that stench was part of the sentence. Dung wasn't randomly chosen. It had cultural significance. It symbolized filth, impurity, and animality. When smeared on a person, it was a statement. This individual was now less than human. The punishment wasn't confined to physical discomfort. It was sensory, social, and spiritual. Crowds were encouraged to gather. There were no whispers of mercy or looks of pity. Laughter, jeering, and chants often accompanied these public events. The more witnesses, the better. Punishment was theater. The streets were the stage. The condemned was the script, and shame was the star performer. Ancient temple carvings didn't shy away from these spectacles. Scenes show individuals crawling on their hands and knees, covered in grime, dragging themselves through town squares while being spat on and ridiculed. Sometimes they were forced to wear animal masks, an ox head, a dog's snout, or a pig's snout carved from leather or clay. Each animal carried a different social insult: laziness, filth, foolishness. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty, it was systemic. Egyptian officials understood how memory worked. They knew people might forget a whipping, but they wouldn't forget the neighbor who paraded around with donkey ears or crawled through the streets in shame. The more bizarre the image, the longer it lingered in the community's mind. That was the point. One infamous punishment involved tethering thieves to a wooden pole with their hands tied behind their backs and faces painted with soot. They were then surrounded by buckets of spoiled fish and left under the hot sun. The stench was unbearable. The symbolism was even worse. They were made to resemble rotting goods, spoiled, worthless, contaminated. The punishment lasted only hours, but the social decay it caused could last for years. Branding was another tool of public shame, but it wasn't always hidden or subtle. Sometimes symbols were burned directly onto a person's face, on the cheek, forehead, or the chin. These symbols weren't chosen at random. Pig, meant filth, a hyena meant deceit, a jackal meant betrayal. The message was burned into skin, memory, and public record. The location of the punishment mattered too. Officials chose spaces that were central to the community, near temples, marketplaces, and city gates. This placement turned every passerby into a witness and ultimately a participant. Shame didn't thrive in secret. It needed an audience, and Egypt provided one willingly. One punishment reserved for repeat offenders was the ritual of reversal. Offenders were made to wear their garments inside out and walk backward through public spaces. The idea was to invert their social status, to quite literally turn their world upside down. It was a visual metaphor for disgrace. It told the community, this person is no longer who they once were. Sometimes punishment didn't stop with the body, it extended to the home. A thief, after serving public humiliation, might return to find the front of his house smeared with ash or excrement by order of local scribes. In some cases, his name would be scratched from his doorframe. For neighbors and relatives, this was a daily reminder. Disgrace lives here. Egyptians took particular care in ritual cleanliness. Public humiliation disrupted that. Covered in dung, ash, or soot, a punished person couldn't pray, couldn't enter sacred spaces, and couldn't be ritually purified. Shame became a barrier, not just to society, but to the gods. In some communities, children of the disgraced were not allowed to participate in public festivals for years. They weren't explicitly punished, but they were stained by proximity. Guilt in Egypt could be inherited. A humiliating sentence wasn't just a punishment, it was a legacy. These punishments weren't random or improvised. They followed guidelines outlined in temple records and scribal documents. The degree of humiliation was often proportional to the perceived insult against Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of order, balance, and truth. If you disrupted society, society disrupted you back, not with a quick death, but with long-lasting disgrace. One surviving document from the New Kingdom describes a man who repeatedly lied to temple officials. Instead of fining him or executing him, they painted his face blue, shaved his eyebrows, and forced him to serve food at a funerary banquet while barefoot. Guests refused to eat anything he touched. His name was recorded in a public ledger as the tongue that turned against Ma'at. The punishment wasn't just what happened that day, it was how he'd be remembered. That was the goal, a form of justice that reached forward through time, using shame as its vessel. Humiliation by design was not a footnote in Egyptian justice, it was a foundational principle. The goal was simple but brutal. Make the punishment unforgettable, not just for the criminal, but for everyone watching. And in a society obsessed with legacy, what could be worse than a legacy of disgrace? Chapter 3. Crimes of the flesh, adultery, and blasphemy. There were crimes that didn't call for execution, but for something more lingering. Adultery and blasphemy weren't just seen as personal failings, they were direct attacks on the moral and spiritual foundations of society. The punishments, therefore, were crafted not for swift justice, but for unforgettable disgrace. Take adultery, for example. If a married woman was caught with another man, the sentence was not hidden behind temple doors. It was dragged into the streets. The woman would be stripped of her linen garments, exposing her in a culture where public nudity was considered a deep taboo. Her head would be shaved clean, a symbolic act that robbed her of femininity, dignity, and any illusion of status. But the punishment didn't end there. She was forced to walk the length of the town barefoot through the dust and filth of the marketplace while people hurled insults, garbage, and sometimes worse. Temple scribes recorded these spectacles not as rare acts of cruelty, but as standard moral enforcement. Neighbors spat, children pointed, and old women clucked their tongues in judgment. The community did not look away. They were invited to watch. That was part of the punishment. Sometimes the adulteress would be branded or tattooed, a permanent mark placed on her skin, often near the collarbone or cheek. These weren't random symbols. They had meanings: a looped rope for betrayal, a vulture for disgrace. In a culture where social appearance defined your future, a mark like that turned you into a walking cautionary tale. Wherever you went, people remembered your crime. Imagine living in a world where your mistake wasn't whispered about. It was announced by your body every single day. You could never blend in again. Your shame traveled with you like a shadow at high noon. The punishment wasn't about physical suffering. It was psychological, social, and spiritual. Blasphemy was no less serious. Say the wrong thing about a god, deny Ma'at, insult Amun-Ra, or question temple rites, and your soul could be marked for destruction. But before the gods judged you, the people would. Offenders were dragged to temple courtyards, not for private reprimands, but for public exposure. There, surrounded by statues of divine judgment, you were forced to kneel. Priests, robed in white linen, would read out your offenses aloud in front of a gathered crowd. Sometimes the charges were etched on tablets or painted on walls. The message was clear. This was what happens when someone defies the gods. Then came the whipping. Not a brutal beating, but a ritualized display of pain. The number of lashes matched the severity of the blasphemy, often dealt by a temple guard. Each strike carried not just pain, but a warning. This wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about reminding everyone else of the sacred boundaries. Children were brought to these rituals. It was believed that early exposure to public shame would imprint fear and respect. Parents would whisper, "That's the man who mocked the gods." These stories lasted longer than the bruises. They became parables. They became legend. Even after the punishment ended, the stigma endured. A man who insulted a deity might find temple doors closed to him. Priests refused to perform blessings. He'd be shunned from festivals, from funerary rites, from the sacred pulse of Egyptian spiritual life. Sometimes a blasphemer's name was partially erased, not enough to condemn him to complete oblivion, but just enough to weaken his chances in the afterlife. It was the spiritual equivalent of limping forever, neither fully damned nor redeemed. And for the worst of the worst, a combination of punishments was reserved. Forced nudity, head shaving, symbolic branding, public crawling, layer after layer of disgrace. Their stories became warnings carved into walls. Their names became footnotes in cautionary scrolls. Adultery and blasphemy weren't seen as individual betrayals. They were crimes against the order of the world, and the Egyptians responded with punishments that didn't end in a day but rippled forward for generations. A daughter might never marry. A grandson might be passed over for temple service. Shame in Egypt wasn't just personal, it was hereditary. So when we look back and ask how ancient Egypt maintained order for millennia, it wasn't just the Nile that held things together. It was fear of shame, fear of disgrace, fear of becoming the next example paraded through the streets, covered in dung, remembered not for what you built, but for what you destroyed with a single act. Chapter 4. Branding, Tattoos, and Permanent Shame. Branding wasn't just a mark. It was a verdict engraved on your flesh. Some punishments didn't fade with time. They were made to last, to be carried on the skin, worn on the face, and etched into memory. Branding and tattoos weren't decorative or optional. They were weapons of social control, and once applied, they marked a person for life. Imagine walking through the crowded marketplace of Thebes. You pass a man with a scarred animal symbol on his cheek, maybe a pig for filth, a dog for disobedience, or a hyena for deceit. You don't need to ask what he did. His crime is written on his body. He doesn't need to speak. His skin does the talking. Branding wasn't just about punishment. It was about making someone's disgrace permanent. Priests and scribes carefully chose the symbols. The branding iron itself was often forged in temples and heated in ceremonial fires. Its shape determined by the crime. It could be a hieroglyph, an animal, or even a phrase. The location of the mark was just as important. Branding the forehead meant total social exclusion. Branding the forearm or chest meant a constant reminder that couldn't be hidden with sleeves or linen wraps. The process was deliberately painful and highly visible, a public event. The branded were not taken behind temple walls. They were held down in open spaces, often in marketplaces or temple courtyards. Children were brought to watch. Vendors paused their trade. Priests chanted. The hiss of the iron, the scream of the condemned, and the smell of burning flesh. These were part of the ritual, part of the memory being created. And branding wasn't just for men. Women caught in scandal, adultery, fraud, or blasphemy were tattooed as well. But the tattoos weren't placed discreetly. They were often carved into the upper chest, neck, or arms, places that linen couldn't easily hide. The intention was clear. No matter where she went, her shame would travel with her. Some symbols were designed to isolate. A woman marked with the loop of betrayal was unlikely to find a husband. A man branded with the eye of deception could never be trusted again in business or temple work. The symbol became a second identity, one you could never shed. Even slaves weren't exempt from this visual justice. A slave who attempted to escape might be tattooed with a house mark and a warning phrase like "property of Pamu" or "run once, shame forever." These tattoos turned the body into a permanent document, a walking record of sin, ownership, or disgrace. And this practice didn't just target the living. Some Egyptians believed shame should follow you into the afterlife. Archaeologists have discovered mummified bodies with branded skin, scars, and burn marks that survived even the embalming process. In one tomb, a woman had a crude vulture symbol burned into her upper arm. Nearby temple records reveal she was a former temple singer who had been caught in an affair with a priest. Her branding wasn't just punishment, it was a denial of ritual purity, a barrier to spiritual redemption. In another case, a worker buried in a workers' cemetery bore a mark resembling the donkey glyph, symbol of foolishness. His name had been scratched out of the tomb wall. His body was intact, but his legacy had been shattered. The mark ensured that even in death, shame would cling to him. Branding and tattoos weren't always the final punishment, but they were often the most enduring. Whippings and parades ended. Dung could be washed off, but a brand stayed with you forever. It turned your skin into a story, a warning, a curse, and society responded accordingly. A branded man couldn't serve in rituals. His children might be barred from schooling or apprenticeships. His wife, if she stayed, was seen as complicit. If she left, no one blamed her. Landowners refused to rent homes to the branded. Even bakers might charge them double or refuse service altogether. For women, the stigma was often worse. A tattooed woman, no matter the reason, was seen as a social threat, unclean, unfaithful, undesirable. She might be forced to live on the edge of town, near the waste pits or animal pens. If she tried to conceal the mark, her neighbors would remind her. If she accepted it, she became an outcast, whispered about in public and shunned in private. There were no appeals, no forgiveness rituals, no path to erasure. That was the point. Branding in Egypt was permanent, not just physically, but spiritually. It declared, this person has fallen and must never rise again. And perhaps most chilling of all, the Egyptians were proud of this system. Temple texts, court scrolls, and even tomb inscriptions mention these punishments without shame. Some proudly record the number of people branded under a particular pharaoh's rule. Others describe the branding priests, men whose sole job was to mark criminals. In a culture obsessed with order, shame wasn't a side effect. It was the system. So when we think of ancient Egypt, we often imagine golden tombs and hieroglyphs, sphinxes and sacred rituals. But beneath that marble and myth lies something darker. A world where justice meant disfigurement, where tattoos weren't art but sentence, and where every scar told a story that would follow you for the rest of your life and beyond. Chapter 5. The Honey Trap. Insects as executioners. Not every punishment in ancient Egypt relied on blades or whips. Some punishments were quieter, subtler, and far more haunting. Among the most disturbing was a ritual humiliation known as the honey trap, a punishment that didn't use weapons or fire, but instead called upon nature itself. Sweetness became a tool of torment. Insects became the executioners. This punishment was most often reserved for women accused of violating the sacred boundaries of the temple, specifically those suspected of seducing priests or tempting sacred servants into forbidden relationships. In the rigid hierarchy of ancient Egyptian spiritual life, priests were expected to be paragons of purity. Any breach of that purity, real or perceived, was met with outrage. But the woman, not the man, was usually the one to bear the public shame. The procedure began in broad daylight. The accused was taken from her home or holding cell and brought into a public space, usually near a temple courtyard, a bustling marketplace, or the wide stone steps leading to a religious complex. This wasn't an accidental choice. These were places filled with witnesses, where the punishment would become part of daily memory. The woman would be stripped naked in front of the crowd. Her hair was often shaved clean, removing a symbol of beauty, dignity, and status. And then the honey was brought out. Priests and guards would slowly pour honey over her body, beginning at the top of her head and letting it drip, streak by streak, down her skin. The syrup clung to her face, pooled in her collarbone, ran down her chest, and coated her legs. Nothing was spared. It wasn't just a humiliation, it was a transformation. She became bait. The sun made it worse. Egypt's intense heat warmed the honey until it became thinner, stickier, more invasive. It crept into every fold, every pore, every crease of her body. The skin couldn't breathe. The scent traveled for meters. And then came the real torment, the insects. At first, it was flies. Drawn by the sugar, they buzzed in like a wave, covering her eyes, lips, and arms. They crawled into her ears, up her nose, beneath her fingernails. She couldn't swat them away. Her arms were often tied behind her or bound to the wooden post she was lashed against. She had no way to protect herself. Then beetles joined the swarm, followed by hornets, biting ants, and sometimes bees, especially if priests released them intentionally from temple hives. Some accounts even suggest that guards would smear the ground around her with sugar or date syrup to intensify the effect, drawing more and more creatures to the scene. The pain was not instantaneous. It built slowly, itching, stinging, biting. The skin swelled, red welts formed, bites became blisters. The sun cooked her from above, while her own body became a living feast for the smallest tormentors in the animal kingdom. And while all of this happened, the crowd watched. That was the point. People came to see the shame as much as the punishment. Mothers brought their daughters to teach them obedience. Merchants paused their bargaining to mutter and sneer. Children asked questions that their parents didn't answer. It was a public spectacle, as horrifying as any execution, but without swords or fire. This was not about blood. It was about humiliation, about degradation, about turning the accused into a grotesque warning. And still, the punishment wasn't over. As the insects continued their attack, the victim's body would begin to blister and swell. Some women fainted, others screamed until their voices cracked. The honey attracted not only insects, but dogs and wild animals from the fringes of the city. Guards kept them at bay, barely, and the crowd kept watching. Some women were left like that for hours. Some were left for an entire day. In rare cases, if the woman survived, she would be cut down at dusk and allowed to stumble away, bruised, bitten, and broken. But even survival came at a cost. The scars from the insect bites took weeks, even months to fade. Some never did. And the shame? that lasted forever. She would be known not by name but as the honey woman. People would cross the street to avoid her. Employers would never trust her. No man would take her hand in marriage. If she had children, they'd bear the whispers of their mother's disgrace. Her family might exile her. Her home might be abandoned. And in some cases, the punishment didn't stop even with death. Women who died under the honey trap might be denied proper burial rites. Their bodies were buried on the outskirts of town, far from ancestral tombs or family plots. Their names were excluded from temple prayers. Their spirits were denied peace. But why honey? Because in ancient Egyptian symbolism, honey was sacred. It was used in offerings to the gods, in embalming, and in medicine. It symbolized healing, wealth, purity. To twist that symbol into a weapon was a dark inversion. It sent a powerful message. Something sweet can become a curse. Something sacred can become a punishment. Something beautiful, like a woman's body, can be turned into an object of disgrace. The honey trap was never about justice in the legal sense. It was about protecting power. Temple power, priestly power, patriarchal power. The woman's suffering was not just accepted, it was engineered. Every step of the ritual was designed to isolate, humiliate, and destroy her social standing. And worst of all, there was no evidence required, just suspicion, a jealous wife, a whispered rumor, a priest's accusation. That was enough. Egyptian society, so proud of its order and balance, allowed this chaos to unfold in full public view. It didn't hide it. It ritualized it, documented it, immortalized it. Some temple walls even depict the outline of bound women, their heads bowed, with swarms of insects drawn in stylized spirals around them. In one tomb, a priest's scroll refers to the cleansing of sin by sweetness. The irony is painful. So, while we often imagine ancient Egypt as a land of pyramids, wisdom, and celestial harmony, it was also a place where a single jar of honey could become a death sentence, where the smallest creatures could become tools of shame, and where a woman's body, once sacred and powerful in the mythology of Isis and Hathor, could be turned into a living altar of disgrace. The honey trap reminds us, in ancient Egypt, the worst punishments didn't always spill blood. Sometimes they simply waited for the sun to rise and the insects to come. Chapter 6. Humiliating the Powerful. Public shame in politics. When we think of ancient Egyptian power, we often imagine towering statues, grand temples, and gold-laced sarcophagi. Pharaohs ruled as gods, viziers enforced their will, and high priests moved between sacred realms and royal courts. But even in this seemingly untouchable hierarchy, no one was immune to shame. In fact, the higher you climbed in Egyptian society, the farther you could fall, and public disgrace was often the preferred method of bringing powerful figures to their knees. For rulers, officials, generals, and temple elites, execution was sometimes seen as too merciful. Death ended a story. Shame rewrote it. The Egyptian elite understood that public memory was more dangerous than any weapon. If you wanted to destroy a rival, you didn't just silence them, you humiliated them so thoroughly that no one would dare walk the same path. Take the case of Paneb, a foreman during the reign of Ramses III. He wasn't executed when accused of corruption, theft, and sexual misconduct. Instead, his punishment was staged as a public downfall. Stripped of his fine linen robes, Paneb was hauled before the very workers he once commanded. His crimes were read aloud in the presence of apprentices, elders, and temple overseers. Then came the most symbolic act. Paneb's hands were pressed into hot wax, burning imprints into his palms. These were displayed on the wall of the worksite where he once gave orders. Now, those same walls told a new story. This man, once respected, had become a living warning. This wasn't an isolated event. Across temple walls and judicial papyri, we see example after example of high-ranking officials being shamed in deliberately theatrical ways. Why? Because while execution might eliminate a person, public disgrace eliminated their influence. Consider the vizier who oversaw grain distribution during a famine. When accused of hoarding food, he wasn't executed quietly. Instead, he was paraded through Thebes in a child's tunic, bare-legged, bareheaded, and mocked as a boy who stole bread. At official ceremonies, he stood in the back row holding a broken staff instead of his scepter. Everyone knew, everyone remembered. One general, caught conspiring with foreign agents, faced a punishment that mixed absurdity with horror. He was made to wear an oversized wig and women's robes, then marched through the army barracks to the laughter of the very soldiers he once commanded. His ceremonial dagger was replaced with a wooden spoon. His war medals were removed, replaced with donkey dung rubbed into his uniform. That same uniform was later displayed at a training camp, labeled not with his name, but with a phrase, "The general who betrayed." It was humiliation as political theater. Even temple officials faced inventive disgrace. A temple accountant who was caught stealing sacred bread didn't face the sword. He was sentenced to wear a necklace made from moldy loaves and spoiled dates. Every morning, he had to stand at the temple gate, reciting apologies to each worshiper who passed by. For 30 days, his shame became part of the ritual process. This punishment had layers. It shamed the individual, yes, but also protected the institution. By humiliating the offender, the temple preserved its own sanctity. "We do not tolerate betrayal," the punishment said. "We humiliate it." And then there was the weapon of architectural ridicule. An architect who failed in his duties, especially if his mistake caused danger or disgrace, might be sentenced to live inside the very structure he built. If a roof collapsed or a shrine cracked and the error was blamed on poor design, the architect was forced to live under that flawed roof. It was a symbolic prison, a daily reminder that his error was visible to all. Sometimes, inscriptions were added to the structure detailing his failure. In one case, a bridge builder whose project collapsed during a Nile flood was assigned to work as a porter beneath the replacement bridge, carrying supplies in full view of merchants who had once commissioned his services. His name was scratched onto a post near the riverbank, followed by the words, "He who did not respect the river." Even the highest offices were vulnerable. When a vizier fell from favor, whether for failed diplomacy or internal treachery, he could be depicted in tomb paintings in the posture of a servant, crouched, eyes downcast, holding rotten fruit. In one such tomb, the successor to a disgraced vizier had his predecessor painted as a donkey, muzzled and bridled, hauling stones. No one viewing that image could miss the message. Another form of symbolic erasure was forced reversal, making powerful men perform acts associated with the lowest status. A general might be forced to sweep temple floors in silence. A court scribe might be given a child's tablet and forced to relearn letters under the supervision of teenage apprentices. These punishments mocked their former power, reducing them not to criminals, but to fools. There were also festive humiliations, ritualized shaming during state holidays. A disgraced noble might be ordered to serve drinks at a banquet dressed in rags, while musicians played songs about betrayal. Onlookers laughed, the court clapped, but beneath the ceremony was a sharp edge. This is what happens to those who fail the pharaoh. These moments were recorded, not hidden. The bent stele, for example, documents how a Libyan prince, after being defeated in battle, was forced to dress as a temple dancer and serve drinks during a royal celebration in Memphis. His costume, his posture, even his forced smile were etched into stone. It was both punishment and propaganda. But what happened when public shame wasn't enough? When a disgraced official's influence still lingered, perhaps through family connections or loyal followers, the Egyptians turned to a more permanent solution: name erasure. Tombs were defaced, statues were mutilated, inscriptions were chiseled away. The individual wasn't just removed from power, they were removed from memory. One prominent example is Queen Hatshepsut. Though not a criminal, her successors sought to diminish her legacy by scratching her name and image from monuments. The intention was clear: rewrite history, eliminate challenge. Her achievements couldn't be undone, but her memory could be discredited. Political humiliation was also used as a form of warning. When a noble betrayed the crown during a border war, his family tomb was desecrated. His body was buried in a pauper's grave, and a broken pot inscribed with his name was placed in the center of his estate. The message? His legacy was shattered, like the pot that bore his name. Why such elaborate rituals of disgrace? Because in Egypt, power was rooted in perception, and officials' influence depended on how the people saw him, how he was remembered. Public humiliation severed that connection. It turned respect into revulsion. It made sure that no son would follow in his father's footsteps. And it worked. Chapter 7. Foreigners and Enemies. Ridicule beyond borders. When it came to Egypt's enemies, humiliation wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. The Egyptian state turned ridicule into a ritual of dominance. Foreign captives didn't merely face chains or prisons. They were turned into public spectacles, walking emblems of defeat. Their humiliation wasn't just personal, it was political. It served a purpose: to reinforce Egypt's supremacy both at home and abroad. Unlike punishments for Egyptian citizens designed to enforce moral and religious order, foreigners were used to demonstrate what happened when anyone dared challenge the might of the pharaoh. Take the case of captured Nubian and Libyan leaders. After military victories, these high-status prisoners weren't simply executed. Instead, they were paraded through major Egyptian cities in grotesque outfits. Their royal garments were replaced with ill-fitting robes and comically oversized wigs. They were forced to dance, sing, or serve food at victory banquets, mocking their former titles in the eyes of thousands. In one instance recorded on the bent stele, a Libyan prince was made to serve as a literal footstool during a festival at Memphis. Egyptian nobles rested their sandals on his back while drinking wine and laughing. His name was recorded not in honor, but as an example of what happened to those who defied Egypt's divine rulers. And these weren't fleeting moments. Artists and scribes carefully documented these humiliations on temple walls and in tomb inscriptions. Scenes show Nubian warriors shackled in chains, forced to kneel while Egyptian children threw rotten fruit at them. Syrian commanders were dressed as women and made to sweep palace floors. Some foreign generals were forced to wear masks of jackals or pigs, turning them into living caricatures, symbols of disgrace made permanent in stone. These scenes weren't hidden in back chambers. They were carved on temple gateways, palace entrances, and tomb exteriors, ensuring every Egyptian saw the price of disloyalty and the strength of their rulers. But public ridicule didn't end with visual display. Some foreign prisoners were renamed with insulting titles. A captured Hittite envoy, once known for his eloquence, was renamed Mute Dog and forced to carry messages between soldiers. A Babylonian noble became known as Broken Staff, his former symbol of rank replaced with a crooked walking stick. These nicknames were spoken in the marketplace, taught to school children, and etched into court records. Why such theatrical cruelty? Because Egypt didn't just want to conquer bodies, it wanted to conquer narratives. By humiliating foreign leaders, the state rewrote their legacies. A king became a fool, a general became a servant, and the Egyptian people were reminded that their gods had prevailed. This extended to artifacts and offerings too. Captured foreign goods were displayed in temples, but not always in honor. A Mesopotamian chariot was once dismantled and rebuilt upside down at Karnak Temple, hung from the ceiling like a butchered animal. The message was simple: even foreign technology bows before Egypt. Pharaohs also made sure these humiliations were intergenerational. They didn't just ridicule the present enemy, they sought to curse their memory. Statues of defeated kings were dragged through the streets and buried beneath roads, so future generations would walk over their faces. The Festival of Smashing Pots, a ritual in Thebes, included the public breaking of clay effigies shaped like enemy rulers. Their names were spoken aloud, then ritually obliterated, a symbolic execution repeated year after year. One captured prince of Kush was sentenced not to death, but to perform as a court jester. For years, he was kept alive solely for amusement, forced to sing songs of his own kingdom's defeat. He wore bells on his ankles and was called the Laughing One. When he died, his body was buried without ceremony, wrapped not in linen but in palm leaves, and placed under the servant quarters of a palace. Even in death, he served. And sometimes foreign women were targeted too. In cases where queens or noblewomen were captured, they faced humiliation tailored to their identity. A captured princess of the Mitanni was paraded through Thebes with her hair shaved into a checkerboard pattern and her royal jewelry melted down and recast as servant bangles. One record notes her being displayed in a cage of reeds near the Nile like a rare bird stripped of flight. The Egyptians used shame as a diplomatic weapon too. When rival nations visited Egypt for negotiations, they were often received in halls decorated with scenes of their ancestors in chains. One ambassador from Byblos reportedly fainted after seeing his grandfather depicted naked and bound on a temple wall. Egyptian officials offered him water, served in a cup shaped like a Nubian head. Even foreign gods weren't spared. Temples sometimes displayed statues of rival deities bound in chains or defaced with donkey ears. At Karnak, the statue of a Syrian storm god was buried upside down beneath a drain, so every drop of temple water ran over his face forever. To the Egyptians, these weren't random acts of cruelty. They were structured messages, carefully staged, deeply symbolic. Each act of ridicule against a foreigner reinforced the worldview that Egypt stood at the center of the cosmos and all others were beneath it. And yet, this public humiliation of outsiders wasn't just about domination. It was about security. The spectacle of shame served as a national immune system, teaching the people to fear defeat, despise disloyalty, and rally behind their rulers. Because in a land where memory meant immortality, erasing dignity was more powerful than erasing life. Chapter 8. The Ritual of Erasure. In ancient Egypt, to be forgotten was to be annihilated. Erasure was not merely symbolic, it was a calculated and devastating punishment that extended beyond life and into eternity. While public humiliation tore apart a person's dignity in front of the living, the ritual of erasure destroyed their memory, ensuring they vanished from both the historical record and the afterlife. It was the harshest penalty the Egyptians could impose, not death, not torture, but deliberate oblivion. Names were everything in ancient Egypt. A name wasn't just a label. It was a vessel for existence, identity, and immortality. To speak someone's name was to sustain their soul. Funerary prayers, tomb inscriptions, and offerings were all anchored to this belief. Without your name preserved in writing and spoken by the living, your spirit, your ka, would wander aimlessly, unable to rest or reach the eternal paradise. So when the state or temple officials decided to erase a name, it was a sentence worse than execution. It was the stripping away of immortality. The process began with chisels and fire. Tombs were defaced, names gouged out, eyes of statues broken, inscriptions scratched beyond recognition. In papyrus scrolls, scribes blotted out entire lineages, striking names from family records and temple payrolls. Even on monuments, the goal wasn't subtle revision. It was violence. Marks of erasure were made deliberately messy, so that all could see something had been removed. The blank space became its own kind of punishment, an eternal scar on the memory of the deceased. This wasn't done randomly. Scribes followed established rituals, sometimes reciting curses as they struck the stone. In certain temple texts, the erasure was accompanied by the burning of the person's clothing, the smashing of their personal items, and the denial of burial rites. Without a tomb, a name, or descendants to remember them, a person would suffer the second death, the final and total extinction of identity. Take the infamous case of Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh. After he died, his successors launched a statewide campaign to destroy every trace of his existence. His name was chiseled out of walls, his statues buried in pits, and his grand city, Amarna, abandoned and stripped for parts. Temples that had once sung his praises now condemned him in silence. He became a ghost in the records, only rediscovered centuries later by archaeologists uncovering hidden cartouches behind plastered-over doorways. But erasure wasn't reserved for kings. High-ranking priests, viziers, architects, and even ordinary workers could suffer the same fate. A disgraced treasurer named Beken Konsu had his tomb sealed off by his own family. His name was scraped from the family stele, leaving only a rough oval where his identity once stood. His brother's tomb nearby bore the inscription, "Let the forgotten be silent." Sometimes erasure took place even before death. If an individual was convicted of blasphemy or betrayal, temple priests could begin the process while they still lived, denying their names in rituals, excluding them from public prayers, and omitting them from upcoming ceremonies. It was a living erasure, a form of social death that turned them invisible to the divine. The Egyptians understood the fear this evoked. Stories were passed down of men who wept when their names were scratched off public records. One scroll from Thebes recounts the tale of a man who begged the pharaoh to let his name remain on a granary ledger so that my son may speak of me when I am dust. His plea was denied. The violence of erasure even extended to family. To erase a person completely, scribes removed their name from genealogies, severing them from ancestors and descendants alike. In a culture where ancestral lineage was sacred, being cut from one's bloodline was a devastating blow. The individual was no longer a son, father, or citizen. They were nothing. But there was strategy in this brutality. A dead man could be remembered as a martyr. A publicly shamed official might garner sympathy over time, but an erased man? He left no trace, no memory to redeem, no story to tell, no legend to build. And so, erasure became the most terrifying tool in the Egyptian justice system. It was used to silence political rivals, to remove failed priests from sacred roles, and to cleanse family lines of shame. The threat of it kept citizens obedient, scribes honest, and priests loyal. Even the most ambitious officials tread carefully, knowing a single misstep could turn their grand tomb into a pile of anonymous rubble. There were rare cases of restoration when a new ruler reversed an erasure for political gain. The name of Hatshepsut, once scratched from walls by her stepson Thutmose III, was partially restored by later pharaohs trying to legitimize their own claims. But these acts were exceptions. For most, erasure was final. Chapter 9. Social Fallout and Everyday Consequences. In ancient Egypt, punishment didn't end at the edge of the whip or the temple courtyard. The most enduring sentence was the one that followed you home, sank into your skin, and quietly unraveled your life. Public humiliation may have been immediate and dramatic, but the social fallout that came after was often more insidious and far more permanent. A branded face or a shaved head wasn't just a mark of disgrace, it was a sentence to a new identity, one of exclusion, suspicion, and shame. You became a cautionary tale in the flesh, your very presence a walking reminder of failure. Every scar was a story that others whispered about, and no one let you forget it. Take Kenna, a workman from the artisan village of Deir el-Medina. After being caught stealing tools, he was publicly flogged and had his head shaved, a common punishment. But the real punishment came after. He returned home, but his neighbors no longer greeted him. No one shared bread at mealtimes. His name began appearing last on ration lists, even behind new apprentices. His daughters, once considered desirable matches, were quietly passed over for marriage. His family was marked by association. A single mistake had poisoned generations. And Kenna wasn't alone. Entire social records show the quiet daily erosion of a disgraced person's place in society. One man who had served in a temple lost his job after being branded. He ended up sweeping floors near the docks, work considered too lowly even for apprentices. In payroll scrolls, he is listed only as the one who must not eat near others. In Egypt, reputation was more than a social construct. It was currency. With a damaged name, you couldn't testify in court, serve in a temple, or even work on state projects. You were effectively exiled within your own city. Your clothing marked you, no longer the fine white linen of the respected, but dull patched robes that told everyone who you were and what you'd done. In some neighborhoods, shamed individuals had their doorways narrowed, forcing them to scrape their shoulders each time they passed through, an architectural insult etched into daily life. Others had family tombs reassigned or sealed off, the community unwilling to risk associating with someone whose shame might taint the afterlife of their kin. One of the most telling signs of social fallout was found in burial practices. Archaeologists refer to them as grudge burials. Hastily arranged graves, bodies turned toward the wall, smashed pottery, no inscriptions. These weren't the resting places of honored dead. They were final statements of disgust. Families used burials to send one last message: "You are not one of us." Marriage prospects evaporated. Temple scrolls from Memphis outline marital contracts that specifically exclude those with tattoos of shame. The mark of Thoth, a poetic phrase for criminal branding. Some contracts even required a guarantee from the bride's father that she had never been subjected to public disgrace. Even children paid the price. Sons of shamed men were denied entry to scribal schools. Daughters found themselves passed over for religious roles. Inheritance could be withheld. The stain of shame didn't just touch the guilty, it seeped into their bloodline. Sometimes, neighbors whitewashed the painted scenes of family meals or celebrations inside a disgraced person's home. Entire walls, once filled with joyful depictions of domestic life, were left blank, a silent act of social erasure. The message was clear: you no longer belonged here. Chapter 10. The Psychology of Shame, Then and Now. Shame is not just a reaction, it's a weapon. And in ancient Egypt it was wielded with precision. For the Egyptians, shame was more than a feeling, it was a force. It could crush reputations, destroy families, and strip a person of their place in society without shedding a drop of blood. In a civilization built on Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, and cosmic harmony, shame was the emotional hammer that kept everything in line. And the Egyptians understood that punishment didn't have to be physical to be powerful. It only had to be seen. Modern psychology calls this social death. It's the moment when a person is cut off from their community, when they are no longer acknowledged, no longer welcomed, no longer remembered. In ancient Egypt, this idea wasn't theoretical. It was enforced, and it was effective. Every ritual of humiliation, from crawling through temple courtyards to being smeared with dung in the public square, attacked the core of human identity, the need to belong. Egyptians didn't merely aim to punish the body. They went after the mind, the soul, and the very self. When they shaved your head, branded your skin, or paraded you in filth, they weren't just embarrassing you. They were sending a message that you no longer fit into the sacred order. They turned your visibility into a curse. Your mistakes weren't whispered about. They were performed. Public shame was theater, and you were the actor in a play no one wanted the starring role in. Crowds weren't just passive observers. Their laughter, their silence, their judgment was part of the sentence. When the community watched, the punishment stuck. It became folklore, a warning for the next generation. Even the symbols of punishment were psychological traps. Being branded with a pig didn't just mean you were unclean. It meant you were now the thing people were allowed to mock. Wearing an animal mask during punishment wasn't just ridiculous. It was a tool of dehumanization. You were no longer one of us. You were something to be looked at, laughed at, and then forgotten, except for your crime. And the effects weren't temporary. Shame altered identity. People changed how they walked, where they went, who they spoke to. They avoided mirrors. They avoided their own names. The punishment lived in their heads long after the bruises faded. Medical papyri from the period even describe symptoms eerily close to modern trauma. Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, sudden rage, fear of crowds, even hallucinations. These weren't just consequences, they were expected. Judges and priests knew that humiliation could haunt a person for years. They planned for it. In fact, they counted on it. One vizier's notes on sentencing include the chilling line, "Pain is brief, but disgrace teaches the people." Fast forward to today, and you'll find the ancient Egyptian playbook alive and well, just dressed in different clothes. We no longer gather in temple courtyards. We gather in comment sections. We don't smear people with dung. We smear them with screenshots, hashtags, and viral shame. But the structure is the same. Make it public, make it humiliating, make it last. Cancel culture is the digital descendant of ancient Egyptian spectacle. A person makes a mistake, maybe even a serious one, and suddenly their name is everywhere, but not in celebration. Their job vanishes. Their friends go quiet. Their inbox fills with judgment. Screenshots of old behavior become modern tattoos, permanent, searchable, and unforgiving. Online shaming doesn't kill, but it can erase. Just like Egyptian scribes once scraped names from tombs, modern mobs delete a person's digital identity, unsubscribe, unfollow, and scrub them from public memory. The internet forgets nothing, but it can make someone feel like they've disappeared. And just like ancient punishments, modern shame doesn't stop at the individual. Families, co-workers, and even children feel the echo. Reputations become radioactive. One mistake, and entire careers go up in smoke. What's different now is that we pretend it's organic. The Egyptians were honest. Their justice system admitted it used shame to control behavior. We hide it under buzzwords: accountability, transparency, exposure. But the aim is often the same: fear, control, and spectacle. This isn't to say that all shame is wrong. In both ancient and modern worlds, shame is used to protect values. Egyptians used it to defend the sacred, punish betrayal, and preserve social order. Today, we use it to call out injustice, protect the vulnerable, and demand better from our leaders. Shame, when wielded responsibly, can be a form of justice, but it's a dangerous blade, sharp and easy to mishandle. Conclusion: shame was ancient Egypt's most potent weapon, not because it drew blood, but because it carved memory. These rituals, etched into stone and bone, remind us that punishment is never just about justice. It's about control, it's about memory, and it's about fear. Today, we'd like to think we've moved past such cruelty. But look around. The tools have changed, but the instincts remain. We still mark, we still expose, and we still erase. In the end, the Egyptians taught us a chilling truth. Pain fades, shame endures. So the next time you scroll through a viral takedown or see someone dragged through digital mud, remember, you're not witnessing something new. You're watching the revival of the oldest punishment in history.